in Matthew 16, verse number 18, I want to speak to you on a subject today. And the subject that I've chosen is contemporary, just as recent as this week's newspaper. Baptists are not Protestant. Now, that's my subject. Baptists are not Protestant. And my text is in Matthew 16, verse 18. And I say unto thee that thou art Peter. That thou art Peter. We saw something about Peter in our Sunday school lesson a while ago, did we not? In Galatians chapter number 2, he's called Cephas. But he's one of the 12. And in our lesson we had James and Peter and John in their relation to to Paul rather, in the church at Galatia. And Jesus said, thou art Peter, and upon this rock, and I must say in passion, and I'm only using this as a text of scripture, that the rock that our Lord speaks of is not Peter as a man, but rather in verse number 16, the testimony of Peter. And if you look 2 verses up, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. This is the testimony of Peter in relation to Jesus, and this is the rock upon which Christ said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, which is a figure of speech saying that nothing leveled against the church will ever be successful in making the work of the church null and void. We are overcomers. The church is gloriously triumphant. We're in the hands of a great God, and we have as our captain the Lord Jesus Christ, and we cannot be otherwise but triumphant, you see. I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. Now the subject again, Baptists are not Protestant. Now that's a negative subject, and yet I know no way to put it in a positive frame. If I knew of some way, I would do it. But you can understand exactly what I'm going to try to talk to you about and preach to you about in the message of the hour. Baptist. Now, I'm a Baptist. And that shouldn't be a crime that a person will be a Baptist. I mean, in any circle, it ought not to be a crime. It certainly ought not to be a crime in Washington that a person is a Baptist. And surely it would not be a crime in Greenville that a person will be a Baptist. But you know, we live in an ecumenical day. I mean by that, that the thrust of the religious world in this day is toward an all-inclusive church, an ecumenical church, where a person can be most anything that he wants or believe most anything that he desires to believe, and still be recognized and not condemned or judged for embracing a false idea. And that's the philosophy of the day in which me and you live. But Baptists cannot take that. Our people have never taken that philosophy. And so I'm no different, as far as I'm concerned. I don't think I'm any different from all the Baptist preachers that have gone on before me. And I sometimes feel a bit lonely, to tell you the truth. The men that ordained me are dead. The men that sat with us in our council to organize this church, one of them is gone. Brother Henry Jenkins is gone, and gone to be with the Lord. But Clyde Johnson is still alive, but I appreciate him. Clyde Billingsley, I should have said. I appreciate him and myself. But so many of the preachers that I was ordained with and preached to me when I was a young man and then when I was a young preacher have outstripped us and gone on to be with the Lord. And I know of none of those that were ashamed of the fact that they were a missionary Baptist, you see. A Baptist. And there's no crime to be a Baptist. Don't ever apologize to anybody for being a Baptist. Now, I'm aware of the fact that when I broadcast over the radio, that there may be Methodists and Presbyterians and Pentecostals and others that might casually tune me in or accidentally tune me in. I'm aware of that fact. And I'm aware of the fact that when I announce publicly that I'm a Baptist, I turn a lot of folk off. And I may turn some off even in the auditorium when I announce dogmatically that I'm a missionary Baptist. But be that as it may, that's beyond my control. I must be true to my fathers. I must be true to my convictions. I must be true to the book, regardless of who it might affect. I might turn off, you see. Baptists are not Protestant. But in the newspapers this week, you've read several times in bold print that the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest Protestant denomination in America. Now, I'd like to say, with all due regards to the media, and I recognize that the men that write the news stories have degrees in journalism. And they've been to the University of South Carolina and to the University of North Carolina and other great state universities throughout America. And they've studied journalism. They know how to make a paragraph, and they know how to punctuate. They know how to spell. They know how to write. They know how to do research. They know how to excel in their profession as a journalist. And I recognize that fact. But I submit to you that some of these that write our articles that we hear by radio and read in our newspapers just haven't done their homework. They have not done their research. And if a person would casually study a bit, it would not take long for you to see that Baptist people are not Protestant. And I'm not bringing this sermon to clarify or to underwrite the Southern Baptist Convention. Not at all. They're not on my team and I'm not on theirs. I am an independent Baptist preacher. But all Baptists are not Protestants. All Baptist groups are not Protestant. All of our fathers before us were not Protestant. Now, a little research, just a bit of history will show you that what I've said is so. Baptists are not Protestant. And I'm going to approach the subject from three angles, and I want you to listen to that for a while. Number one, I submit to you that there is a great historical difference between Baptists, as we have them in our day, and Protestants. With no disregard to Protestant in making that statement, it's just a matter of historical data, historical facts that we're different. And then second, there's a great doctrinal difference between Protestants and Baptists. More than you've ever, you'd never know there's any difference at all if you read the newspaper and believed everything you read in the newspaper. Will Rogers said in his lifetime, all I know is what I read in the newspaper. Well, we've reached a point in our day where you better have a little bit more knowledge than what you read in the newspaper, to tell you the truth. And that's certainly true with the subject that I'm dealing with today, because the news media would have you to believe that Baptist people are Protestant, when the fact of the matter is that there's a great doctrinal difference between Protestants and Baptists that I'll mention in a moment. And then number three, there's a great congregational difference. The operation of the local churches among Baptists is greatly in contrast with the operation of the local church among the Protestant denominations. Now, with those three divisions, I want to talk to you a moment today about the fact that Baptists are not Protestant. Historically, Baptists are not Protestant. The Protestant Reformation began to emerge at the end of the Dark Ages. Most of you that have studied history at all know the period of time in the history of the last 2,000 years called the Dark Ages. That period began about 600 A.D. and began to close out with the Renaissance period about 1200 A.D. And they have about 600 years that historians classify as the Dark Ages. And the Roman Catholic Church, and by the way, prior to the Protestant Reformation in 1525, or in that general area, literally 1517, but I'm always for round figures called it 1525. Prior to that day, there was nothing but the Catholic as far as an organized church is concerned. An organized hierarchy is concerned. There was no Methodist, no Presbyterian, no Episcopalian, and Baptists have never been organized into an ecclesiastical unit, where Baptists have always been a local church-oriented and not a hierarchy-oriented, you see. And so prior to the Protestant Reformation, only the Catholic Church was one world denomination until her power was broken by what we call the Protestant Reformation. But the Protestant Reformation, or the discontent among European people as well as Italian people, began to emerge about 1200 A.D. It was in 1415 that John Huss was put to death, long 100 years before the day of Martin Luther. And John Huss was put to death because he wouldn't bow to the papal decrees handed to him out of Rome. But not only did John Huss die, but thousands of dissidents, historians call them, of dissenters, historian calls them. Many of them were Anabaptists at heart, died at the hand of the inquisitors. The Inquisition was born at 1220 A.D., and was not disbanded until 1808, only 200 years ago, 175 years ago. And in the Inquisition, literally thousands of Jews were put to death, and literally thousands of dissidents were put to death, like John Husk and many, many others whose names will have to wait until the resurrection morning. But thousands of them died. But that kind of thing, the sale of indulgences, for example, and if you know anything about church history, you know that that was the straw that breaks the camel's back and actually sparks the Protestant Reformation. The sale of indulgences was a pernicious act of the Catholic Church that would allow a man to, for filthy lucre, for money, to get off the hook for any crime he might commit. Drunkenness, adultery, stealing, killing. He could buy his way clear from the Catholic Church by placing in the hand of the priest a certain amount of money. And it was called, that kind of practice was carried on by the Catholic Church for centuries prior to the Protestant Reformation, and it's called the sale of indulgences. And that kind of thing began to accumulate. And more, there was unrest in Europe. For example, the Crusades created a great deal of unrest that laid the foundation for the Protestant Reformation. The Crusades were Roman Catholic armies of mercenary soldiers paid by the Roman Catholic Church and by wealthy landowners in Europe to expel the Muslims from Jerusalem. And they sent one crusade after another to fight the Muslims, to drive them out of the city of Jerusalem. All of that agitated unrest in Europe and other places of the old world against the Roman hierarchy and the papal system. And it became increasingly worse. And after a while, other men began to speak out. And that climaxes with a man called Martin Luther, who lived at the beginning of the 1500s. And Luther was a Catholic priest. Luther had no intention, I'm talking historically now, Luther had no intention of becoming a Protestant. He had no intention of dying, being anything but a Catholic priest. He had been a Catholic priest and remained, or would have remained, had it been possible. But he got converted reading the Roman epistle. And I trust that he was converted. I have no reason to believe that he was not converted. Yet he never fully became a Baptist, a long ways from it. But he posted his arguments on his church door against the Catholic Church and willfully and deliberately withstood all the decrees that were leveled against him by the papal authority out of Rome. And finally, he was excommunicated. He was put out of the Catholic Church. And of course, that sparked what we know in our day as the Protestant Reformation, 1525. That would be 470, about 60 years ago. The Protestant Reformation in Germany is where the Protestant Reformation fire caught, and it spread. And with the Protestant Reformation, you have the birth of the Lutheran Church. And the Lutheran Church is with us today and in Greenville. And with the birth of the Lutheran Church, soon thereafter, you have the birth of the Presbyterian Church under Calvin. Luther and Calvin were contemporaries, you see. Now, neither of those men believed in Baptist doctrine, 1,000 miles from it. Don't ever call yourself as a Baptist a Calvinist. You might just as well call yourself a Lutheran. The Baptists are neither Lutherans nor Catholic, nor Presbyterian, nor Calvinist. I prefer not to be called a Calvinist. But anyway, the Presbyterian Church was born in the ministry of John Calvin. And then soon later, you have a Protestant uprising in Catholic England. And you have the Church of England, which is the Episcopalian church born. All those churches were born in the 1500s, 400 years ago and more. Now, while all that's going on, now listen to the preacher. While all of that's going on, Anabaptists, rebaptizers, we were called, and the word Anabaptist means rebaptizers. All that time, from the time of the Inquisition at 1220 A.D., right straight on up to the Protestant Reformation, 1525. There's 300 years. In all that period, Baptists were baptizing converts upon a profession of their faith by immersion, total immersion underwater. And Baptists in all that time were fellowshipping together in their local assemblies throughout all of Europe. There is no historical record that Baptists ever organized into a convention until recent years. The Southern Baptist Convention having been born in 1845 in Augusta, Georgia, 100 miles away from Greenville, is the birth of the Southern Baptist Convention, 1845. That's a date everybody ought to remember. But I said all that to show, or try to show to you, that while the Protestant Reformation was born in the days of Luther and Calvin, it did not affect Baptists at all. In fact, when the Protestant Reformation broke and Luther was excommunicated from the Catholic Church, and he started the Lutheran Church, Baptists thought that they had a champion in Luther, and they also thought that they had a champion in Calvin. But they soon found out that neither Luther nor Calvin were a friend to what Baptists stood for and what Baptists practiced. In fact, both Luther and Calvin persecuted sorely our fathers. And John Calvin actually stood idly by while Anabaptists were put to death in Geneva, Switzerland in his lifetime, when he could have stopped it, but because he didn't. Because not only was Calvin a preacher, but he was a politician as well. And he could have stopped that persecution, but he didn't do it. Both Calvin and Luther despised Baptists. Now you see, it doesn't take a smart man to recognize that it would be unwise to classify Baptists and untrue to classify Baptists as Protestant. Now I know that there's some Baptist leaders who say that the Baptist movement in America was born in Rhode Island under Roger Williams about 1600 or 1625. I don't buy that. I come to submit to you that those that came over from the old country in the 1600s and those that came over from the old country in the 1700s, as did my people, and my people came to this country in 1758, Baptist. But not only did my people come from the old country Baptist, and they came from the Lutheran country, but my people came over here Baptist. Thousands of other persecuted Baptists out of Europe, the Netherlands in particular, England, and France as well, migrated across the Atlantic and settled this country in the early 1600s and in the 1700s. And the idea that the Baptist movement was born in America is totally ridiculous and historically untrue. And I don't want you to buy that. Not at all. It's just not a historical fact at all. Our people came and migrated to this country in the early days of the founding of the early colonies way back in the 1600s. And hence the Baptist movement began in this country with European immigrants. My people landed in Charleston and they moved immediately up to Columbia because in the 1600s all of the coastal area was given away to the British by King George and land grants to Englishmen that came over. And great plantations were built up and down the coast of the Atlantic by English people. And by the time my people came, they had to come inland. And my people settled 100 miles away from the coast because there was no land on the coast. It had all been given to English people. That's why you have so many Episcopalians up and down the coast of our country, you see. But inland, my people had to settle at Columbia, near Columbia, in a colony of Baptist people. And they came over here Baptist people. They didn't start, my people didn't start a Baptist movement in South Carolina. They came over here Baptist, you see. And they were not Protestant. But I'm trying to show to you that historically, there's a world of difference between a Baptist and a Protestant. But not only, and I must go on because I've only a limited time, but second, I remind you that there's a great deal of difference doctrinally between Protestants and Baptists. Well, now, preacher, what is the difference doctrinally? What doctrine do Baptists hold that Protestants do not agree? Or what doctrine does the Protestant believe and practice that Baptists cannot accept? Now, if you just hold your seat, I'm going to mention just four. I could mention four others, but I'll mention for the sake of time only four great doctrines and policies that Baptists would not and could not embrace, that are embraced by the Protestant movement. I begin, number one, with pedobaptism. Pedobaptism is infant baptism. The Catholics are the originators of infant baptism. The first historical reference of any infant baptism was in 370 A.D., about 300 years after the death of the apostles. You find it gradually, for convenience sake, for other reasons, infant baptism becoming more and more prominent. And after 370 A.D., it's only a few hundred years until infant baptism becomes the baptism. And of course, that's sprinkling. Sprinkling, no immersion, is involved in infant baptism. Now that Baptists could not embrace. Well, you say, well, that's Catholic. I know, but when Luther came out of the Catholic Church, he brought out with him pedal baptism. Luther never immersed anybody. He called Baptists dipperers. And he was not trying to be complimentary. He was trying to be insulting. Luther did not believe in baptism for consenting believers upon a profession of their faith by immersion. He didn't practice that, didn't believe that. But instead, he practiced infant baptism, pedal baptism. Now, my soul, there'll be no way in the world that a man could honestly call Baptist Protestant if I had no other reason but that one. Because Baptist, in our position on baptism, is just about as far away from the Protestant position as a position can be. And it seems to me that these highly educated journalists from the University of South Carolina ought to be able to recognize that. And what I'm talking about today is simply elemental theology and history. And I'm not a journalist, but I do know a bit about history. I went to the same schools they went to, and I minored in history myself. And I know a bit about history. And I say, if any honest person will study history, he'll have to admit that the Protestant movement was birthed and born in pedal baptism. It didn't become pedal baptistic, but it started out pedal Baptist, baptizing infants. And Baptists have never been a part of that. May I say this to you? The most controversial one thing in all the Christian world is baptism. And I don't think my people made it that way. I honestly and sincerely believe, now listen to you, Pastor, that the way we baptize at Tabernacle is exactly the scriptural way, both to mode and purpose and testimony. As far as I know, Baptist people baptize their converts exactly as the New Testament commands. Now, would you make me a rabble-rouser for following the New Testament pattern? After all, I have the New Testament I can read for myself. And as far as I know, our baptism is New Testament. But you'd have a hard time finding pedal baptism in the New Testament, infant baptism in the New Testament. And you'd find a more difficult time to find sprinkling in the New Testament. It just isn't there. Now, I'm not a journalist from the University of South Carolina, but I'm an old preacher that's been plowing through this book longer than these journalists have been living. It just isn't there. Now, I'm not a journalist from the University of South Carolina, but I'm an old preacher that's been plowing through this book longer than these journalists have been living. I was preaching this gospel when it was still wet behind the ears. And I know what I'm talking about. Baptists have never sprinkled anybody. Our people, none of our people, have ever sprinkled anybody. I have not found one historical sentence, a paragraph in all my reading that would lend to the idea of sprinkling as a mode of baptism. Baptists have never done that. Now, Protestants did that from the word go. From the first day of the Protestant Reformation, they have practiced sprinkling and pedal baptism. So that's a doctrinal position. And you could never recognize it or reconcile it. There will be no way that Tabernacle Baptist Church could ever be reconciled to sprinkling or to pedal baptism. Then second, Baptists have never recognized any priesthood. We've always championed, our people, our Baptist heritage has always championed, and don't you ever forget it, the Bible truth of the individual priesthood of every believer. Now that's a theological term that I've just given you, but to put it down in good, plain English, you can pray yourself anytime, anywhere, under any circumstance, for any reason, is what we mean by the priesthood of every believer. When that mother sits at the bedside of a little 6-year-old girl and tells them a Bible story, and then the two have a prayer before they go to bed, they have as much liberty and license to do that as a man has with a long robe and a crucifix about his neck and chanting a song with a smoking incense pot in his hand. In fact, I'd rather sit down with the mom and the little baby than to sit down with that priest. I'm simply saying to you that Baptists have never recognized a priest. We have one priest. His name is Jesus Christ. He stands at the right hand of the throne of God on high, ever living to make intercession for me. The Bible tells me to call no man father on this earth. Now that's a doctrine. That's a position doctrinally that you'd never be able to reconcile between Protestants and Baptists. Now why does the newspaper, you saw it, how many of you saw that this week in the paper? Why does the newspaper keep on saying Baptist or Protestant? Now somebody hadn't done the homework. And the only person I can charge is that those that write those news reports just don't know ABC about their church history. And then third, the doctrine of the security of the believer. Baptists believe that once a man is genuinely saved, he's secured by the same grace. Brother Hoseas sang New Grace a while ago. Oh, my soul, I needed the grace wrought for me at Calvary, but I need the grace of God right now. And I shall need the grace of God on tomorrow. And the song he sang a while ago talks about the grace of God when I come to die. I shall need it then. I know I need the grace of God, and I would not take liberty. The grace of God is no cloak for iniquity. God forbid. But the fact remains scripturally and doctrinally that we that are saved are secure. Catholics don't believe that, and Protestants generally don't believe that. One or two other denominations does, the Presbyterians do, but Methodists don't, and the Lutherans don't. No, Church of England doesn't. Pentecostal people doesn't. How in the world could I find fellowship with a Pentecostal church who teaches apostasy and that a man can once be saved and then die and go to hell? When I confidently and sincerely believe that once the man is genuinely born again, he's secure. That's a doctrine. And you'd never be able to reconcile that doctrine with the Protestant movement. Not at all. Now, calling Baptist Protestant, somebody's admitting their folly and admitting their ignorance. And I want our people at Tabernacle to know the truth. And that's why I'm preaching this sermon to you. I believe what I'm preaching is true. I challenge any person to scripturally deny anything I've said or historically deny anything I've said so far. And then there's a fourth doctrine I mentioned. Great doctrinal difference between a Protestant and Baptist. And that fourth one is pastoral leadership. Whether you're aware of it or not, Baptists down to the ears have recognized the pastors as the overseer of the flock. And we, in theological terms, call that pastoral authority. You can call it what you may, but it's just a matter of New Testament principle that the pastor of a local church is in the seat of authority. Now, my soul, you think with me just a minute. If you left the Baptist movement, if you left Tabernacle today and went into any Protestant church in Greenville, you would find none of that. Not a one. Now, I'm not fighting the Protestants, and I'm not fighting the Catholics. I'm simply declaring to you that I'm a Baptist. And one of the reasons, because of our position in relation to the pastor. Now, what am I saying? For example, if you went into the Methodist church, you would find that the conference headed up by a bishop sends the pastor of his choosing Or the church may recommend, but that's as far as they can go. The final decision is in the hands of the Methodist Conference. And the Methodist Church don't know whether their pastor will be back next year or not, or whom they may get when they lose their present pastor. The Baptists don't operate that way. We've never operated that way. Nor do we operate that way today. Catholics operate in the same fashion. The Pentecostal movement, the Church of God, operates in the same fashion. Now, Baptists, that's not Baptistic. And we can never reconcile that, you see. All the Protestant denominations operated by their conferences or by their synod or by their fellowships. But in the Baptist movement, every Baptist congregation is the final authority, which is to say that there is nobody outside of Tabernacle Methodist Church that can dictate the policies of this congregation. And it pleases the congregation of Tabernacle to have the pastor they have, then there's nobody that can do anything about it. They may not like it, but nothing they can do about it. We believe in pastoral leadership. And then there's a third great difference between Protestants and Baptists that I want to mention to you, and that's a congregational difference. A difference historically, a difference between Protestants and Baptists doctrinally, and third, a difference between Protestants and Baptists congregational wise. Now, what do you mean, preacher? I mentioned three things. Number one, Baptists believe in the autonomy of the local church, which is to say the freedom, the total freedom of the local church. Now, we're Baptists, but no other church, no other Baptist preacher in the world has any authority in this church. Not a one. To illustrate, suppose Dr. Lee Robinson were here today, and all of us esteem him as a great God-given leader among independent Baptists. And suppose he was our guest, and for some reason we would have called church conference. And suppose we were going to license a young man to preach, and that young man just didn't have the looks of being a preacher. Maybe he looked a little simple like I do, and maybe he looked a little bit uncouth like I do, and maybe he walked in a strange sort of way. And Dr. Robinson would have said to himself, I don't think that young man has any qualifications for the ministry. Now we're about to vote. Our church is about to vote on this imaginary young man. I don't have any idea who he is, but he's an imaginary young man. And we're going to vote as to whether we'd license him to preach or not. And I'd put the motion, and everybody would vote to license this uncouth young man that doesn't have any natural gifts, it looks like. All would vote to license him, and then the negative. I put the negative, and Dr. Robinson would stand up and say, I vote against that. I demand that it be tabled. No. He couldn't do that. Not in a Baptist church. He might do that in a Methodist conference. He might do that with a Pentecostal Hoseas. He might do that with a missionary, association of missionaries amongst other Baptists. But he wouldn't get anywhere Tabernacle doing that. No. With all due regards, I say, Dr. Robinson, it's none of your business. You're not a member of this church. Please be seated. Wouldn't I do that? You see? Now only Baptists operate that way. We believe in the autonomy of the local congregation of people. And we didn't start believing that when Tabernacle was born 31 years ago. Baptists have always believed that. Right. And then second, congregational, this church is ordered by the people, controlled by the people, owned by the people. Now, my friend, without being critical, and I'm not throwing stones, some people think maybe I am, but I'm not throwing stones, I'm simply stating the fact. You couldn't say that about Methodists. The Methodist churches in Greenville are owned by the conference. You couldn't say that about Catholics. Their own church, all their church is owned by the Pope. You couldn't say that about the Church of God of Cleveland. It's owned by the Church of God denomination. Couldn't say that about the Episcopalians. It's operated by the Archbishop of a certain diocese. On down the line. You can only say that about Baptists. We are congregationally ordered. The people called their pastors, determined their budget, and owned their property. Every single brick, every foot of ground is owned by the people of Tabernacle Baptist Church. Now that's a congregational difference between Protestant and Baptist. And then, number three, there's no regimentation among Baptists. You don't regiment Baptist people. You don't twist the arms of Baptist people. You don't coerce Baptist people. Our fathers wouldn't take it. In 1789, Charles the Great, King of France, had passed into law in France that every infant born in France had to be sprinkled, had to have infant baptism. Now, it wasn't a matter of religious preference. It became the law of the land in 789 in the reign of Charles the Great. That every baby, we have several babies here today, every one of these little tiny new babies, had to be carried to the priest. And that's 800 years. Oh, that's 800 years before the Protestant Reformation. 789 A.D. Every infant child. That's in the days when there was no organized denomination but Catholic. And Charles the Great was a Catholic. And he did that because the Pope encouraged it and demanded it. And he capitulated and passed it into law. Now, when that law was passed in France, thousands of Anabaptist mothers and daddies said never. And they had to leave their homes and hide themselves in caves and in the mountains to protect themselves from the fury of the church that demanded their infants be sprinkled. Now, you don't regiment Baptists that way. You just don't tell Baptist people what we must do, or what we cannot do, and what we must do. This church determines its own operating policies according to the New Testament. Right. And I would resent government or religion coming to Tabernacle and trying to regiment. You don't regiment Baptists. Now, you may regiment some people. But when you regiment Baptists, you've got a fight on your hands, sure enough. It has never been done. Thousands of my fathers have gone to a fiery stake and died rather than to be regimented. And I think the same thing would happen again if any attempt was made to regulate or regiment Baptists in our day. Baptists are not Protestants. May we stand with our heads bowed. Our Father, I brought, I think, a very important message to our people. A current problem that we've seen emerge in our newspapers repeatedly this week. Baptist denomination, Protestant denomination, making the two synonymous is not intelligence, but I think deliberate ignorance on the part of some religious leaders, and especially on the part of the news media in our day. Now, help our people to accept the historical data that I've given and search for themselves to see that indeed Baptists have always championed the things that I've reminded them of today. And we could never be Protestant. We could never be Catholic. We're always have been and always shall be a local church, a congregation of Baptist people. Bless us and help us to be faithful to thy word, I pray. Heads are bowed.
Keep yourselves from the accursed thing, lest ye make yourselves accursed. When ye take of the accursed thing, and make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. When I get involved with that which I should not, thinking that I will not get caught, it affects not only me, but my whole family. Lord, help me do the things that I ought. Keep yourself from the accursed thing, lest ye make yourselves accursed. When ye take of the accursed thing, and make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. Lord, I want to do what is right, to stay away from every wicked thing. I want to walk in the light. Joshua 6:18. Keep yourselves from the accursed thing, lest ye make yourselves accursed. When ye take of the accursed thing, and make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. Keep yourselves from the accursed thing, lest ye make